Thank you, everyone. We're in the final stretch for today. So we're going to move into the process of, and Professor John will explain the process of the recommendations. But before we do that, I'd like to give the floor to Director Rosas from the ILO to talk a little bit about the trade unions. So if we could kindly give him a moment of your attention.
Thank you. You don't have trade unions in Nigeria. So that's one of the points that I wanted to mention. But before because we had on the side discussion with my colleague, Monsieur Terry, who raised the issue of terminology. And the fact, I think now I understand, because within the forced labor, the two elements that help define forced labor is the coercion and the fact that it's involuntary. So really victims are trapped into this circle. But I think that the issue was more on what is used mostly for statistical purposes of sex sector. But this doesn't mean, I mean, the broader concept of decent work, and the ILO has initiatives also in this area, but the frame of reference is the decent work framework that, as I said at the beginning of my intervention, one of the elements, defining elements of decent work is that, you know, the concept of human well-being. So I don't think, because then we enter into the discussion, is decent work, is not decent work. That is not decent work. But for the purposes of forced labor, these are, according to the international instruments, the qualifying aspects that refer to it. Yes, there was an issue that was raised, what trade unions do. I'm sorry, maybe I should have mentioned this during my presentation, but just for brevity, I didn't get into this. There are, in many countries, trade unions are quite active in countering and in preventing forced labor and human trafficking. As my colleague said next to me from Nigeria, of course there is an issue that in many countries the trade union movement needs to be strengthened. It's the coverage of the union density is quite low, but there are also contexts where they are quite active and energetic. One of the examples is here in Italy. Here in Italy, in the south, this forced labor that mostly, and trafficking that mostly affects irregular migrant workers, the main actors on the ground that really go to the fields because there is, how to say, particular concentration in agriculture, is done by local trade unions, that they go, they detect the victims, they bring them out, they provide shelter, they connect them also, and they provide legal services, and they have also programs that somehow they boost the skills and help these people to move out of exploitation. There are several examples of this that we have collected. Likewise, also what employers are doing. We have just established a business network of against forced labor and human trafficking with a number of rules and standards that employers must follow and businesses must follow, including giving support through access to skills and jobs, which was one of the proposed questions. Maybe we have not discussed in depth, but certainly this material is available, and we are more than happy to share it with the organizers and to share it with you. The last thing I wanted to mention, it's true that there is an overall deficit in terms of jobs. And that, you know, the technology, there is this ongoing discussion, and many people are afraid of actual jobs to be taken by robots. But there is a need, and this is what we've seen also during the Industrial Revolution, where there were the ludists, no? That they said they were against technology because they thought that they would have taken out the jobs from human beings. But also the statistics that Professor Archer mentioned, I mean, they relate to the changes in the world of work, most of them affecting low-skilled workers. But what is demonstrated is that most of the jobs, they will not disappear. What they are changing are the tasks. And hence I connect with what Ms. Proteo was saying of this concept of lifelong learning. This is on one side. On the other side, there are so many new jobs that have been created. Think of, for instance, the care economy in countries like many advanced economies where there is an aging of the population. Think of the jobs that they are connected with the environment, the green jobs and so forth. So I think that the most important thing there is to manage these transitions. But I would concur with what Monsignora dijo in terms of forced labor and human trafficking of being a crime against humanity. And so giving priority to eradicate this problem, and also to give priorities of former victims to access decent jobs. Thank you very much.
Okay, colleagues, I think we're at the stage where we move to the final part of today's business, which is to begin a task which I think requires some dexterity and some patience on your part, which is to come up with a set of recommendations that, broadly speaking, takes us to another place. I remind colleagues that it is clear that the focus is on victims. And however they may be defined in the labour market or through prostitution, the aim is to provide, from our discussions yesterday, this morning and this afternoon, some collaborative thoughts, succinctly put, clearly, I hope, expressed, so that we can move forward to a better place. So the proposal is in two parts. First, that I should summarise, if I may, and this is personal to me, excuse the mistakes, errors, or misrepresentations, but it's the best I can do, of each of the sessions we've had, the 3 sessions, with some explanation, some notes I've made, and then for me to listen to points that you may wish to make, points that are ones that I can put very simply into a document, because this is the second part of the process. And then, if you will allow me tonight, I will try and put together with colleagues an appropriate document which should be able to be circulated at the close of business tomorrow, bearing in mind that we have 2 sessions to come, best practices in resettlement and addressing successes and failures. And in fairness to the due fairness of their case being heard, we cannot prejudge what they might say, so we should listen to that with an open mind. But in as far as it's practicable to do so, to come up with a set of points, my proposal is to put it onto PowerPoint, which will mean that it can be shared easily in the room, let's hope, and that it will require some elaboration, discussion, but hopefully with a conclusion that will fit the purpose, or at least get the spirit of what it is we've done. Let me remind you about yesterday. The theme was interstate levels of collaboration to aid victims. And for me, the message that came across was clearly not just the role of state and government, but in particular the role that national legislatures or parliaments might have. And in that connection, there were a number of themes relating to education, the dissemination of knowledge, IT, Also, I think the terms of reference, which I think fits very well our notion of our local parish and parishioners. Notwithstanding the bishops and the bishops' conferences and the role of the Vatican and Pope Francis, all of this is relevant, but the aim is to be inclusive, to be explanatory, and to be educational, in bringing forward a collective sense of the human dignity involved in the protection of victims. Human dignity is defined by each of us in our understanding as to who our neighbor is. But it must transcend neighborliness into the world of making things work. It may be too ambitious at this stage to think of a victim's charter. It may carry too much baggage from one particular geology or another. But it strikes me that, in effect, that is what we're trying to do in creating interstate levels of collaboration. We cannot pretend that the story is good, because there are more weaknesses than there are strengths. But taken ahead, there is, I think, the toolbox, the building blocks on which participation may take place, and the role of the state and its interconnectivity between NGO, parishes, and civil society may take place, including our international colleagues and friends in the ILO. I think that is an important start. This morning, we looked at a very important issue, not least because it seemed to be quite easily captured by lawyers, but despite the fact that lawyers may have a lot to say on it, it had a message which I think transposed itself into action. And in particular, there was a compelling case, was there not, about joining the anti-money laundering activities that all our states have signed up to with the problem of human trafficking. It seems so obvious with the benefit of hindsight. I kept thinking, why did I not think of this before I came here? And that may compel us to believe that often the sensible and simple and the most obvious may work. We know in practice there are obstacles. Anti-money laundering is a toolbox upon which banks have today to work. So at least we have an institutional base which is recognizable nationally and internationally. It also may give rise to very interesting synergies between the interests of the consumer, after all, we all use banks and financial institutions, and the role that we may play in enabling our prosecution authorities and police to work together in a collaborative mechanism. We then move to the notion of compensation. It has, I think, a number of elements which are not necessarily complementary, but may in effect complement the notion of helping the victim. We heard a compelling case, one case note, of litigation giving rise to compensation. So that is one model. But equally, we heard of cases involving prosecution, where the prosecution may either end up with some fund which is held as reparation, or some way of taking the victim into the synergy of the justice system and providing a rehabilitation for the offender through the repatriation of goods and services for the benefit of victims. It is a sophisticated tool. In countries like Japan and Asia, it's practiced more widely because the victim has a part more naturally in the criminal justice system. But even in the United Kingdom, we have found the need for victims to have a voice, and so I commend it to you as a thought that we might put it forward as a reasonable package to assume that compensation may be payable either into a fund which comes from the proceeds of the crime, there does such exist funds, or a more robust arrangement within our compensation authorities. We have a body in England, some countries do, some don't, where you can apply for funds. The latter, I think, presents more problems than the former, because putting the trafficked person into the vocabulary of people who are regarded as criminals takes some cultural change in both the attitudes of the police. There are very few prosecutions after all, and there are very few successful ones, and often the prosecution does not necessarily have all the evidence to produce that outcome. But there is no question that there is something important about compensation either as a way of bringing the citizen, the victim, into citizenship and back to society, or as a way of bringing the processes together of where we may go. The last session was, in fact, perhaps the most conceptually challenging. The reason is that the notion of corporate social responsibility is a notion that has been embedded in many companies for some time as part of what we call corporate governance. It has aspirations that I think have far exceeded realities. But we should not take the notion of aspiration badly. Aspirations are, after all, what we have to live on when we have little else. What I think is useful about it is it does open up a Pandora's box of delights, insofar as we can see companies that have good practice from bad. And we can also do something which I think comes from the two sessions, which is the notion of data. We have good states and bad states. We have good data, we have bad data. But nevertheless, if we knew that a state was good in certain practices, it would help to encourage the ones that are not so good to behave better. And the bad states, well, I do not think we shun them, but we encourage them to double their efforts to get to where we think they ought to be. I like the idea of the economic instruments of both penalty and reward. I do not think it's possible to live in a world where it is only penalties. Reward is often the human dynamic of betterment, of doing the best we can, and perhaps data is the way to do it. But I was very moved and struck by some of the interventions this afternoon. The personal qualities of people to come here and tell us in a public place of their private grief and their private route that took them to this room is compelling. They have a voice, which I don't. They have an authenticity, which I don't. And if they are able to share it with the world, we're going to be a better place. So the use of CDs, the use of videos, all of this seems to me to become a theme which runs from the three sessions we have heard. But equally, technology is the world today, robotics and so on. And it would be silly for us not to recognize the good side of technology as well as the bad. The good side is it opens up traceability, and traceability gives rise to better transparency. And I think one of the things that comes across is that the educative value of knowing and having knowledge, of evidence and proof, makes compelling proof of what it is we do. We cannot work simply on the moral theorem that we will all do the right thing. We have to be persuaded, cajoled, and sometimes taken slightly by the hand to the better place. And I think that there is a great potential for the video, for the dissemination of these ideas to a broader audience. Pope Francis is correct. The crime against humanity, involving all aspects of trafficking, is what our humanity defines us to do. And on that basis, I think we have at least a conversation. And I will now go to listening mode. I'm not going to respond to the comments, I just want to write them down, in which case I hope I will do a good job of being able to transpose some of the ideas I hear, or points, or indeed disagreements, into a workable document that is not going to be long. I hope it's going to be relatively short and succinct, so that you can actually take forward out of this very important discussion today and yesterday points for the future. We have to be optimistic, and we have to move forward in the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was very eloquently done. Very, very good job. We'd like to hear from you now on each of the topics that we covered in very short 40-character Twitter speak, so that we can take the substance of your ideas and encapsulate them, and then we'll add the eloquence of Professor John. Okay, so on the first topic of improving interstate collaborations, what are your reactions to the summary, and what language would you like to see encapsulated in recommendations?
Yes.
Yes, please.
No, Thank you very much for this very interesting summary. I just discussed with Monseigneur the question of human trafficking as a crime against humanity. I must say it's clearly a must, and we are not yet there. Because if we look at the definition of what is a crime against humanity, it needs a widespread practice. And it's close to the genocide, to the definition of genocide. So I think I completely agree with you, Monsignor. We need to make this a moral duty, like when President George W. Bush changed the definition of torture in positive law. You had the US Conference of Catholic Bishops issuing a handbook, torture is a moral issue. And it was co-signed after that by Orthodox, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish religious leaders. And I think we should go on with this. And I was very much inspired by what Grégoire told this afternoon with the French, I must say, lobbying. So we need to do that at the international level. We need to do that, and possibly the best way to do it is not only by a network, but really by a coalition. Because, for example, the 97 Ottawa Convention Against Landmines, the 98 Rome Statute of the ICC, both, among others, international treaties, were adopted after a campaign by a coalition of like-minded states, international organizations, and also civil society. So actually, yes, that could be certainly one proposal of our meeting, and thank you very much again for this very interesting meeting.
Not only the Pope said this, but also in the first meeting about trafficking, the 17th of September of this year, the representative of the Holy See, Gallagher, that the Minister of Foreign Office, said this. And he said to me, and the Nuncio said the same, that this was for the first time that the countries heard this, and many of them go to him to say, yes, it is. This is one thing. The other thing, if you read what are the categories of crime against humanity in Wikipedia, they say asesinato, exterminio, esclavitud, deportación, encarcelamiento, tortura, violación, persecución, desaparición forzada de personas, crimen de apartheid y otros actos humanos de carácter similar que causen intencionalmente grandes sufrimientos o atenten contra la integridad física y la salud mental o física. Is this? Just this. It's cuestión de put together these definitions with the trafficking. So it's very clear. Thank you.
Sister Eugenia.
I think that we have a lot of definition, but what it is missing is applying the definitions. So now how can we really strengthen this definition to make them to become a law, but a real law that all the countries can really assume? And
at the moment, we don't have the definition that the traffic is a crime against humanity. It was for the first time the Pope said this,
yeah.
And the representative of the Pope, and ILO not accepted this. This is clear. And for this reason, we don't invite another meeting that we do, ILO, because we have a great discussion about this. They don't want to accept it that prostitution is a crime against humanity. That is clear.
Yeah, but the point is that if one group is not accepting this, it doesn't matter. But now we say it, and we, with a strong voice, repeat about this is for us, for all of us, a crime against humanity. It has to be really punished It has to be taken into account as it is. Otherwise, every time we repeat over and over again the same statement, but we have to come out with a very clear statement that this has been accepted by a group of people, that another time they came, they reflected upon, and they have the courage once again to state, because now we are the ones that know the suffering of these people. We want to give them back their dignity, their values, their life, their future. We cannot destroy, regarding prostitution, we are destroying a generation of women. And if we destroy a generation of women, we destroy the society, we destroy the church, we destroy people. And so now it's a high time that we speak with the same voice and saying, slaves no more. Thank you.
I think Father Behe wanted to say something, and then Alicia.
You know the question, how do you... Drug dealing is a crime against humanity. We could take on domestic abuse. We take on a lot of things. You know, it is a crime against humanity. There's no question. And I don't think anyone here disagrees. I thought the definition that Mr. Murray gave was a pretty concise definition. And I would like for us, you know, I don't know anything about landmines. You know, it's certainly a crime. The human trafficking in persons, the human trafficking in labor, and the organ donor, forced procurement, not donor, I apologize. That's what I'm thinking we're talking about. And I would like for our parameters to be defined, confined to that, you know, not that the other issues are not very important, but I would like some parameters, because at least I know my work is never going to come across landmines or, you know, I'm not going to, drugs are a great crime against humanity, but I'm not going to deal with that. I think we need a focus. Thank you, sister.
Bueno, gracias. Muy bueno el tema de las recomendaciones. Muy bueno porque nos permite dejar algo y después volver a nuestros países con el documento. Las recomendaciones, muy bueno. Hoy me olvidé de decirles, un poco esta mañana, en dos oportunidades quise decirles, pues me olvidé, yo anoche estuve con el Papa, ustedes saben, los que no, que yo lo conozco hace muchos años. Todo lo que tenemos en nuestra ONG lo tenemos gracias a él. Y estuvimos compartiendo un ratito y les mandó muchos saludos y bendiciones para todos y para todas, ¿no? Y estaba muy contenta con el simposio. Creo, Margaret, que eso era muy importante de decir. Monseñor, como siempre, el agradecimiento. Él se saca con sus amigos y manda las bendiciones. Por supuesto que sí, pero bueno, hay que reconocer eso. Con respecto a lo otro, con respecto a las recomendaciones, a mí me parece importante esto de que las políticas públicas de conseguir la participación de todos los estados en la reparación de las víctimas y el trabajo con las organizaciones sociales en la constitución o en la conformación de programas, porque, a ver, retomando y haciendo una síntesis de todo lo que vinimos trabajando, las empresas, y volvemos a lo anterior, las empresas, así nomás, es difícil que tomen a una víctima de trata, es difícil. Entonces, por ahí, si los estados piensan en políticas, con programas y demás, oportunidades, aunque sean por un año, es una posibilidad. Políticas públicas de reparación a través de programas y becas. Becas. No solamente becas de estudio, becas de trabajo, porque por ahí es más fácil la beca de estudio. Y otra cosa importante, por favor, incorporar el tema de la prostitución. Lo dice Benedicto y lo dice el Papa Francisco, yo digo el Padre Jorge. Bueno, el tema de incorporar la prostitución, ¿sí? Por favor. Porque, bueno, es el tipo de trata que más violación y más mujeres hay inmersas en el tema. Y bueno, y que como recomendación también, un próximo simposio, le seguimos dando trabajo para trabajar el tema de la demanda, por favor. Es eso. Gracias.
Nobody heard me. Ms. Moran? Okay.
I would just like to add that we are told that we shouldn't set up a false distinction or a hierarchy among victims. While I can understand the well-intentioned place that comes from, what I would say is that we in the abolitionist movement are not setting up a hierarchy, but rather recognizing one that already exists. Because I believe that we do need to recognize the distinction between being exploited by being trafficked into legitimate industries and by being trafficked into systems which are exploitative in and of themselves. There is a difference to be observed.
Thank you, Ms. Dula.
I want to come back to something that the Pope said in an audience with a group of us who were working on trafficking in 2014, when he said that the Church, therefore, cannot remain silent. The Church, the Pope, is one voice, perhaps, obviously, from all of our points of view, the most effective global voice. But none of us can let go of our responsibility that we are the Church. And if we're looking at our responsibilities in relationship to the state, part of our responsibility is to hold the state responsible for its international obligations. That therefore means that we need to know what those obligations are, and we need to be clear about where they're falling down and to not collude. And sometimes we do collude because either it gives us status, it gives aspects of the Church status, it gives us funding, and therefore we're in danger of colluding because of survival of our organisation, etc. But actually, if the Church cannot remain silent, that silence is about the victims. We cannot remain silent about the impact of policies and of poor legislation on the victims. And therefore, if we're looking at the legal settlements around any of these issues, we need to look at those settlements and their impact on the victims in the different country, the legislative frameworks where they are, because those are the blocks that the United Nations or international instruments hold to account, the national frameworks. We, therefore, need to understand them. And I really do follow on from what Alicia has just said. We do need to look at demand. Now, it may be that when we look at demand, some of that demand is about looking at it. I hold my hands up. I'm an abolitionist through and through, and my focus would be on prostitution. That's my expertise. It's 30 years of work. But I accept the knockover into things like domestic servitude, other forms of forced labour. We can't ignore them. But to be honest, if a woman is taken for sexual exploitation in domestic servitude or other forms of labour, that is clearly rape. It is clearly rape. Nothing can define it in any other way. I might argue that in forms of prostitution it is often rape too. But the reality is we need to be really clear how we define those things, because there is a danger that we are being fooled into mixing things together, and we are part of creating a lack of clarity. And I have to say that I was appalled recently to see a definition in a recent government document in the United Kingdom under sexual exploitation, where it talked about adult victims are deceived into travelling to the UK either by being offered work, including sex work. That actually, to me, is a travesty of language, and I've challenged it with the minister concerned. But you can see how very subtly language slips in, and if we are not very aware all of the time in holding government to account, we end up colluding with it. So I think we need to really strongly say something around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Muñoz.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, más que nada quiero agradecer la invitación aquí al Vaticano. como saben, creo que es mi primera vez que viajo. Bueno, fui víctima de lo que fue trata de personas en la modalidad explotación sexual y me ha sonado muchas cosas que han hablado hoy todos los líderes de las organizaciones no gubernamentales. Una de las cuales es de que como víctima o exvíctima nosotros no queremos, y hablo por todas mis amigas que hemos sido rescatadas, no queremos como, no sé si se pueda decir como migajas, no sé, no queremos que nos den como un periodo de prueba de un trabajo por un año o que nos den otra cosa, sino simplemente queremos que nos den las herramientas necesarias para que nosotros podamos salir adelante como cualquier otra persona. Es decir, en México nos están dando la oportunidad tanto de poder tener una carrera, poder estudiar una carrera o poder tener una empresa nosotras mismas. Eso es lo que nosotros necesitamos, no necesitamos como otra cosa más que nos den la oportunidad de tener la capacidad de tener nuestras propias herramientas, tanto para poder ser líderes y hablar en todas las naciones acerca de lo que está pasando, para que nosotros podamos ayudar a otras víctimas a que sean supervivientes igual que las demás. Y pues, como en México se los comento, se ha dado muchas oportunidades, tanto de darle voz a la víctima, a la superviviente, y la verdad como, no sé, o sea, simplemente el hecho de, bueno, en la Biblia misma lo dice, ¿no? O sea, no hay que darle el pescado a la persona, al hombre, hay que enseñarlos a pescar. Entonces nosotros es lo que queremos, que nos den esa oportunidad, esas herramientas de tener estudio, tener todos estos programas que podamos tener igual que cualquier otra persona para poder nosotros mismos tener un trabajo digno y salir adelante con dignidad. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
I couldn't agree with you more as the end product, but I think we've got to work through this stage by stage before we get to what kind of training, what kinds of work, because frankly, some of your proposals, do you know how much it costs in Britain to have 1 year's professional training? A minimum of £3,000 and a maximum in a university of £9,000. Now, where's this money going to come from? Now, I think that's an admirable aim, that people should have the training for the jobs that they want, eventually. But I think we've got to be systematic. First of all, if we make it too desirable straight away, in the form of go to university and, become a lawyer, become a doctor, become anything you like, you will have an encouragement to false claimants of being trafficked, pretended claimants. So I think the first thing we need is a very clear system of identification of who has been trafficked. And that's what we spent a lot of time on this morning, which I think was very productive. Not because one is looking for criminalization or identification for its own sake, but because it's stage one of sorting out who are the real sufferers, the real victims, from anybody else. And one of the really big problems is this confusion that's arisen between trafficked persons, asylum seekers, and economic migrants. Now, we've really got to be crystal clear on who the trafficked are so that we can give them benefits that we would not give to an economic migrant, who, in my view, should take their chance on the open market. If they are simply an economic migrant, there's nothing wrong with being one at all. Morally, it's fine. But it's a risky business. The person takes the risk in their own hands. I've got many Romanian friends and some goddaughters who've done exactly that. Good luck to them. But they are not trafficked people, and they're not asylum seekers. And insofar as they have suffered in ways that are minuscule compared with what you have just described. So the ID of the trafficked person, to me, has to come top of the list. And then we work towards what recognition do we give them, what do we do to prosecute those who put them through it, how do we compensate them, what do we do about their life ambitions that are restorative, rehabilitatory. But it's like a waterfall that goes downwards, but it has to start at the right place. You can't just have a fuzzy definition that allows everybody to have access to these resources, because everybody will want them. See what I mean?
Melissa and then Gregoire.
Thank you. My colleagues and friends, I'm distressed that we're discussing whether or not someone who is prostituted, that is to say, who is selling sex acts in order to survive, whether this is a legitimate victim or not. Let me give you a couple of examples. A woman in Lusaka that I was speaking to said to me, "I'm sorry, I have to go now. I have to feed my children tonight. I have to perform 5 sex acts in order to get a sack of mealie meal, and I'm a voluntary sex worker." That's not a choice. A woman in India says, "I might as well prostitute because I'm expected to tolerate sexual harassment in my regular job, and I'm getting paid 1/3 of what I would make in prostitution, so I might as well go." A woman in the US who is prostituting at a gas station because she needs a tank of gas to get to a job interview, and she's performing sex acts. I beg you, let's don't qualify victims in this way. The Dutch were so brilliant at one specific meeting about 30 years ago. We never used the word trafficking historically. Prostitution was a crime. Abolitionists were against it. It's simple. Coercion and consent are issues we can discuss until the cows come home, or whatever the good Italian expression would be. I don't know what that is. I'm sure it's more clever than that. But
the word trafficking entirely.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Well,
Please.
I'm sorry, this is not what this meeting is for, and it's not what 5 years of our work has been for. On that argument, any prostitute is somebody that you want to address and improve the way of life for. Fine. Go ahead with that cause.
No, I'm saying she deserves a choice.
Trafficking.
I'm saying she deserves a choice. And in a review of 18 studies in 12 different countries in the world, 84% of everyone in prostitution was under some form of coercion or third-party control or trafficked. That's a conservative number, 84%. Why are we discussing the very small, why are we spending our time trying to figure out the small percentage who are truly voluntary, if you think that. That would be my suggestion, is to go right to the issue of prostitution.
Okay, I think we need to move on and go back to my original idea of Twitter speaking.
Yeah.
Gregoire?
Sorry. All these people work in this. It's impossible to speak about the thing that they work. You want to speak only for forced labor, but these people are not working forced labor, working in prostitution. So we are invited and all the right to speak. Sorry. They are all the time that they need to speak. Sorry.
Gregoire?
So I think when it comes to the conclusions, and perhaps there is a way forward with, I hope, what will be a proposal. When I looked at the conclusions of the former meetings, there was always a section on the of the qualification of the facts, the statements of principles and values, and then concrete recommendations. When it comes to the qualification and the principles we stand for, I think what is important and not complicated to do is to take a clear stance on trafficking, but also on the destination of the crime. So trafficking is a very technical crime, very technical: transfer, harbor, control, for the purpose of, and with the use of means. And those means are controversial, because in some countries like mine, you don't need to qualify to characterize the means. Even without coercion, even without fraud, deception, recruiting someone for the purpose of forced labor, for the purpose of prostitution, is a crime. We are not interested in the means. The means come only as aggravating circumstances of the crime. So what I suggest, I think, is we could, together, collectively, take a stance on both. On the technical crime, I would be happy if we could say trafficking human beings violates the dignity of the human person. Forced labor, which is one of the destinations of the crime, violates the dignity of the human person. Prostitution, which is another destination of the crime, violates the dignity of the human person. The traffic of the trade in organs, which is another destination of the crime, violates human dignity. And all of those are crimes against humanity. I think we're not asking for more. We just want to articulate this technical crime and the purpose of the crime on which we have to take a position. Otherwise, we will let markets to be developed, because we can't tackle trafficking if the trafficking fuels a market which is protected, which is encouraged, which is justified, which is trivialized. So I think for the qualification, I would be extremely happy, for my part, if we could just say that trafficking and those purposes are crimes against humanity. When it comes to the concrete recommendations, I would have many, but I just would like to focus on one, which is related to what I was presenting earlier, which is the primacy or the priority of the status of victim over all other considerations. The concrete examples, I think we have to recognize victims with rights and not illegal migrants. Policies on migration can't have the primacy over the protection of victims. They deserve rights. Migrants are not illegal or not, they deserve rights. And that's our statement, that we have to give primacy to that status. Victims with rights and not criminals. Legislations are criminalizing the solicitation by prostituted persons. That's not what we stand for. The primacy of the status of victim should allow to decriminalize the victims. Victims with rights, even if they cannot cooperate with the justice. That it should not be a bargaining. You can cooperate with the police and justice and then you have a residency permit. No, that's not what we stand for. Primacy of the status of victims over any other consideration. Victims with rights to compensation, even if the traffickers are not solvent. Yes, we have to find an option. The state has to be accountable and to provide that compensation. So I would like that we bring powerfully this notion of prioritizing the status of victim over all other policies on migration, finances, criminalization of the activity. So personally, if we can achieve those two things, qualifying as crimes against humanity, trafficking and the purposes of trafficking, plus having this primacy given, I would be extremely happy.
Thank you, please.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, quería comentar, son varios puntos. El primero sería, que ya lo acaban de mencionar, que no solamente todas las formas de trata, de la misma manera que lo acaba de decir Gregor, es que no nada más sea una, sino si hablamos de todas estas que mezcla el protocolo de Palermo, que por separado puedan quedar como delitos de lesa humanidad, y que cuando hablemos de trata con fines de explotación sexual, se marque el tema de género como algo importante porque tiene un rostro y son en su mayoría mujeres, y que no podemos hablar de trata sexual sin hablar de prostitución, porque precisamente el problema de fondo es la prostitución, y la trata en el sentido global actual es para abastecer la prostitución, y es alentado este consumo a partir de la pornografía y de las relaciones desiguales de género. Otra tiene que ver con los protocolos internacionales, entre estos está Palermo, que se pueda generar una revisión, porque hacen una mezcla, como lo decía Dearlove, esta mezcla que hacen precisamente no permite generar una atención específica sobre cada uno de los delitos, y todos tienen una importancia. Sin embargo, las víctimas, los victimarios y quienes se benefician de estos delitos son diferentes, y no podemos generar estrategias de prevención adecuadas mientras sigamos poniendo todos estos en una misma definición. Ahora, quería comentar una cosa respecto al origen de la prostitución como un dato histórico. Bueno, no el origen de la prostitución, sino más bien el origen del reglamentarismo que plantea la prostitución como un trabajo, que surge en Francia con el modelo higienista francés, y uno de los padres del reglamentarismo, que se llamaba Jean du Châtelet, era un médico que planteaba que la prostitución cumplía en la sociedad el papel del drenaje, y que la vagina de las prostitutas era el equivalente a una alcantarilla. Y justamente esta idea es la que fundamenta el reglamentarismo y que plantea que la prostitución es un mal necesario. ¿Cuál es la implicación política de no hacer un análisis a profundidad de esto? La implicación es que se considera que cumple una función social, y mientras no cuestionemos que esta función social se basa en una supuesta idea de las necesidades sexuales masculinas, creemos que estas aluden a lo biológico, pero en realidad aluden a la cultura. La sexualidad humana es parte de la cultura y de las relaciones sociales. Y esto es muy importante que lo veamos, porque justamente creo que cuando hablamos de programas de atención, cuando hacemos leyes y cuando se generan modelos para trabajar directamente con las víctimas, si no contemplamos esto, no se puede hacer mucho por la reparación del daño, simplemente se toman medidas paliativas porque no arrancamos de la subjetividad y de lo que las personas piensan respecto al fenómeno estas ideas base. Y como ejemplo quería traer pues los movimientos abolicionistas, no de la abolición de la esclavitud sexual, sino de la abolición de la esclavitud por el color de la piel. Se abolió en la ley. Sin embargo, vivimos en un mundo lleno de racismo, y estamos viendo grupos fundamentalistas blancos que siguen atacando a las personas y las siguen discriminando. Entonces esto nos muestra que si no atacamos el problema de raíz, no basta con mencionarnos en contra o decir, estoy a favor de decir que es un delito de lesa humanidad, pero no basta con que lo digamos, sino erradicamos, y erradicar significa arrancar de raíz. Y no podemos arrancar de raíz la trata de personas si no planteamos que la prostitución es una máxima violencia contra las mujeres y que es violencia feminicida. Y si la planteamos como violencia feminicida, ya hay varias autoras que lo han planteado, estamos hablando de terrorismo sexual. Y esto es una realidad, que vivimos en un mundo que nos está matando. En México hay 7 mujeres asesinadas por día, solo por el hecho de ser mujeres, y esto tiene que ver íntimamente con la prostitución.
Last word, sir, please.
Gracias. Bueno, está bueno el debate. Yo quiero traer a colación un poco una visión desde la geopolítica, ¿no? Es decir, ¿quién está haciendo investigación sobre prostitución? ¿Quién está haciendo investigación sobre trabajo sexual? ¿Y cómo se están acaparando los espacios de creación del conocimiento? Al menos en México y Latinoamérica se ha conformado un grupo que se autodenomina GlamSex, que es un grupo interdisciplinario de investigaciones sobre mercados sexuales, ¿no? Entonces, cuando hablamos de mercados sexuales, estamos normalizando la violencia contra las mujeres, porque en su mayoría, como afirmó Ixchel, es contra las mujeres. Y la reflexión que quiero traer un poco también con lo que dice Gregoire y Alicia de trabajar la demanda, tiene que ver con, yo trabajando directamente con los proxenetas, con padrotes en el estado de Tlaxcala, en México. Ellos me compartían su filosofía, ¿no? Ellos argumentan que es un oficio, el oficio de prostituir mujeres, ¿no? Y ellos tienen 4 pasos fundamentales. Uno es ser bien verbo, es decir, desarrollan una forma de envolver a las personas para engañarlas, seducirlas. Luego tienen un lenguaje corporal, es decir, ellos se hacen conscientes de sus sentimientos, de sus emociones y utilizan su cuerpo para fingir tristeza, alegría, ¿no? Son grandes actores y también desarrollan un arma letal, como dicen ellos, que es la lectura corporal, es decir, a partir de no tener ningún contacto directo hablado con la víctima, ellos pueden saber si esta mujer tiene alguna tristeza, algún abuso sexual incluso, y a partir de eso van construyendo una forma de reclutarlas, ¿no? Y otra cosa fundamental que tienen ellos es matar el sentimiento, es decir, es cómo actúan sin sentir ninguna culpa cuando están seduciendo y cuando están enamorando. Esto me lleva a entender como estas fisuras que tiene el sistema de relaciones de género en la actualidad, ¿no? Al trabajar con los proxenetas, yo acostumbro dar una frase de Nietzsche que dice que quien mira a largo tiempo al abismo corre el riesgo de caer ahí. Y entonces después, cuando ya estuve en el abismo, descubrí que no iba a caer, sino que estaba viviendo ahí, ¿no? Y entonces una de las primeras cosas que pensé es hacer una escalera para que varios de los hombres que estábamos ahí pudiéramos salir, ¿no? Y entonces me di cuenta que las escaleras se rompen, ¿no? Y que pueden quitarse. Entonces lo que ahora digo es que ¿por qué no llevamos luz a ese abismo? ¿No? Cambiamos ese lado oscuro de nuestra humanidad y le damos luces. ¿Por qué lo digo? Porque a partir de la experiencia que he tenido en los últimos años con Ixchel, a partir de las investigaciones que hemos hecho, somos peritos, ¿no? Es decir, ayudamos a los jueces para establecer los delitos de trata de personas y feminicidio, ¿no? Y luego utilizamos estas investigaciones para sensibilizar y capacitar. Y la mayoría de los varones con los que hemos trabajado, la idea que queda en ellos es que descubren parte de algo de padrote que llevan dentro, ¿no? Algo de proxenetas que lleva dentro de ellos y algo de feminicidas, ¿no? Entonces esto nos devela algo más profundo, es decir, una cultura que nos construye a los hombres como violadores, como proxenetas, como feminicidas, ¿no? Entonces se trata de cuestionar nuestra masculinidad y la construcción de la masculinidad. Si no podemos acceder a develar todo este poder que construimos sobre las mujeres, y no es un poder contemporáneo, es un poder histórico que surge desde la creación del patriarcado. Si no desmontamos todo esto, no vamos a poder hacer mucho. Entonces, muchas de las capacitaciones que damos ahora en Tlaxcala, sobre todo, es que descubrimos que no solo es develar las formas de operar de los padrotes en un proceso de desproxenetización, sino que tiene que ver con un proceso de despatriarcalización, es decir, cuestionar seriamente los privilegios que nos da el sistema patriarcal, y hemos descubierto que operamos con un modelo que se llama modelo C7, que es desarrollado en Estados Unidos, en California, para hombres violentos, ¿no? Entonces adaptamos este modelo para entender cómo nos construimos como hombres violentos, como hombres proxenetas y como hombres feminicidas. Y yo creo que sí es necesario que los hombres nos hagamos responsables de nuestra violencia, si no, este mundo va a seguir como se ha construido hasta ahora. Gracias.
These are all very valid points, and thank you all for your passionate advocacy. You've worked very, very hard today. I think we want to continue this discussion over dinner and continue to feed in your thoughts and your substance to our scribe here, who will be encapsulating them. Okay, thank you.
Just for a minute, everybody, if I can say, I just, 1 second, everybody, before you walk out the door. It's a very, I agree with Margaret how difficult this has become, and I wish to support the objectives of what the leadership. I am taken, and I think you all should be, with the description that Gregor has made about this. The descriptor of the varieties of and ways this becomes trafficking, right, and a crime against humanity, seems to be a very excellent compromise to capture everybody's thoughts. And so I would make that recommendation, if I may, humbly, and having been here with you for these past 2 days, it's the same problem we encounter in the organ front. It is absolutely the same. So if I may make a recommendation, is to have a description that is encompassing of the thoughts that have been here in this room for the last 2 days. I think that that will serve the purposes of what has been expressed so passionately. That's my humble suggestion.
Please, Rosie.
Well, I want to say the same. Most of us, we have the same recommendations, that we could see the sexual exploitation, the organ traffic, the labor, the forced labor, all kinds as lesa humanidad, as a crime against humanity, and that we could really put the word prostitution as one of the crimes. In Mexico, as Melissa was saying, most of the girls that has been exploited in these sexual areas, 90% are victims of human trafficking, even though people think they are prostitutes. They are prostituted. And of course, that 10% that they say they are because they will, that we don't have in the law also the means. We also have it as aggravants in Mexican law. But these 10%, most of them were in violence in their homes. And since they were children, they were being forced, even they were children, and then they say they are there because they want, but most of the girls that we have talked to them, they were in violence, sexual violence in their homes. So yeah, it's very important for us also the recommendations, as Gregoire was saying, I think he expressed it better than me. His English is better. Thank you.
Gregoire, please write your recommendations.